Rod D. Martin. That's the name of my guest. No one knows what the D stands for, including Rod D. Martin. At least if he tells you he knows what it stands for, I have a feeling he's just making it up. So we're not even going to go there. Rod D. Martin is the founder and CEO of Martin Capital, the daily brief author behind the Rod Martin Report. Folks, I read it constantly. It's loaded with stuff that I don't see other places. Rod not only brings the information, but acumen, A-C-U-M-E-N. I don't know what those letters stand for either. Rod Martin, welcome back.
Good to be here.
Listen, there's a lot to talk about as usual. Where should we begin? Can we talk about the bizarre anti-Semitism? I didn't think I would ever live to see actual anti-Semitism again. It's a little bit freaky to me. And because we have a satanic enemy, it's confusing. There's a lot of there are just a lot of voices out there that I think are not helping. I guess the most grievous thing, besides everything that comes out of Candace Owens' mouth, because all the grievous stuff has to take second place to that. But the most grievous thing besides that is Tucker Carlson's tremendously foolish platforming of Nick Fuentes. I cannot, for the life of me, understand what would have possessed him to do such a thing. And then to put everybody affiliated with him, whether it's Turning Point, my friends at Turning Point, they are just all heroes over there, Heritage Foundation, to put them all in this bad position of being affiliated with somebody who just platformed one of the most truly vile voices ever, Nick Fuentes. That's deeply troubling. So maybe we can start there.
Well, Fuentes benefited us to some degree by being platformed because he tells us openly that Hitler and Stalin are cool. So, okay, I automatically know, and lots of normies know, that if you think Hitler and Stalin are cool, you are not. And so that much is good. But yeah, Tucker gave him nothing but softballs. I'm just shocked by what I'm hearing. You know, there's all this talk of, funding from Qatar and so forth. I don't know about that, but here's what I do know. Tucker the other day was talking about how the genocide in Nigeria against Christians isn't a genocide and it isn't really Islamic. It's just tribal, don't you know? And I'm just like, okay, so it's not just anti-Semitism, it's pro-Islam, wherever it happens to be doing something evil. And where on earth did Tucker Carlson go awry to such a degree? It's just mind-boggling. But we see this in a lot of places on our side all of a sudden. Some of it is just pure isolationism, and they're upset that Israel gets foreign aid. I don't think they really understand how that is evolving over time and how much of that is joint development of military assets and technologies that we benefit from. It doesn't really matter. I get the pushback against foreign aid. That's fine. But when you cross over into effectively supporting Hamas, which is a lot of what this is, you've clearly crossed a rather staggering line. And the idea that Israel was committing a genocide in Gaza is utterly belied by what we found out since we have people in Gaza. It's just absurd. First of all, you have a significant obesity problem in Gaza. But second, Donald Trump pointed out that the ratio of civilian to military deaths in the Gaza conflict is the lowest in the history of urban warfare. Nobody has ever been as careful not to impose collateral damage as the Israelis, while Hamas was actively using hospitals and schools as military sites in contravention of the Geneva Convention, thus making those sites legitimate military targets under international law. So all of this is nonsense at best. Some of it is truly ignorance because people are hearing all this propaganda, but the people behind it are clearly seeking to demonize not just Israel, but Jews. And there's a reason to it that we must not neglect. If Israel doesn't own that land for the last 2,500 years, if that isn't legitimately a nation after 80 years, then neither is America, because we too, came here from somewhere else. And that's the real aim. It's ultimately about delegitimizing America.
Well, okay, there's a lot there. So first of all, I want to give you an opportunity to reprise what you just said. You hear these reports of quote unquote genocide, ethnic cleansing. I'm always baffled, most of all, Rod, by where do people get this information from, and is there any truth to it? Because I would certainly believe that governments are capable of doing bad things. I mean, under George Bush, we had the Abu Ghraib scandal. We had a number of things that I was ashamed as an American, because I expect my government to behave in a way that is 1,000% honorable to our enemies, to everyone, that we hold to certain standards. And I think that it's legitimate. We ought to criticize our own government and other governments if they're out of line. That's clearly on the table. But somehow folks have magnified whatever it is that Israel was doing in such a way that it seemed impossible for me to really get clarity on what these voices were saying. Or is this what I suspect? It's just, Palestinian propaganda. It's leftist propaganda against Israel, against the United States. That there's no truth there. That's what is unclear to me.
Well, this is why you have something that is increasingly being called a red-green alliance. The commonality between the communists and the Islamists is their hate for America. And as I just said, delegitimizing Israel is a backdoor path to delegitimizing America. That's what they're really after. And not just America, but the idea of nation states, the idea that we could rule ourselves and not be ruled by some elite. And all of that is wrapped up in the American idea and America's overwhelmingly powerful military, which is able to maintain its nationhood and not be subsumed into some international organization. And so, all of these things are packed up together. But as to the genocide question, let's just ask the obvious. If the Israelis are some international cabal that's in control of everyone, in control of Donald Trump, in control of the Bolsheviks, in control of Hitler somehow, all these insane things that we're hearing out of the Nick Fuentes crowd, if they're that powerful, then who could have stopped them from just carpet bombing Gaza? Who could have stopped them from napalming every square inch of the West Bank? What is stopping them from killing a couple million Palestinians and being done with it? And of course, this is absurd. They haven't done that. They haven't done anything remotely like that. They haven't even killed many civilians by the standards of urban warfare historically, even that urban warfare which we have conducted in places like Fallujah. Urban warfare is just ugly. It just is what it is. Did Israel attack Gaza? No, Gaza attacked Israel. And you can talk about, it's an occupation. The irony of that, of course, is that Israel completely withdrew from Gaza in 2006. It was the not at all occupied part of the Palestinian territories. And it's got natural gas assets offshore. It's got the opportunity to be a city-state that's as wealthy as a Singapore or a Dubai or a Monaco. It chooses not to be. It had really good city water infrastructure, for instance. You know what they did with it? Hamas dug up the pipes and turned them into missiles to fire into Jewish schools. That's what they did for the last 20 years. And that's why there had to be a war. When they started raping and killing teenage concert goers, what else was Israel going to do except defend themselves?
Well, and this is where part of what I see happening now is this is where you get into the conspiracy theories, and you have a lot of people, young and old, who are very susceptible to this. People who are, I'll just say, foolish, who do not have discernment, and they get sucked down these rabbit holes into things that where nothing is true and everything's a secret and everything's a conspiracy. And, so there are people who will say, it doesn't make any sense that Israel allowed this to happen on October 7th. It had to be an inside job. It had to be, the Machiavellian Jew, Benjamin Netanyahu, who secretly wanted this to happen to give him an excuse to carpet bomb Gaza. Now, there are many people who believe that. Now, again, folks, I don't know every detail of the truth, but that is a big thing to say. That is a big thing to say. It's a question. It's a good question to ask, 2 years ago. But do we think that President Trump is so ignorant that he wouldn't care about that, or that people who care about Israel wouldn't care about them doing something like that? So people throw this stuff out there, and then people who don't really have the time to look into the details, they just buy it and they run with it. And so Israel is to blame for everything. Even when their people get their throats cut, Israel was behind it. And I think that part of the problem in having this conversation is that there are many people that they simply lack discernment, and they're attracted to those kinds of conspiracies. I mean, listen, folks, there are actual conspiracies, real ones. So, but that doesn't mean that they're all true. And I think we have to have discernment.
Well, we really do. And look, if the Jewish leadership in Israel or elsewhere had this extraordinary power over the whole world, then what was stopping Netanyahu from carpet bombing Gaza? But he didn't. What was stopping him from carpet bombing the West Bank? But he didn't. None of that happened. He could have killed 1 million Gazans if he'd wanted to. He had the power to do it. They did the exact opposite of that. So it's absurd on its face. These things can't both be true. But the other thing is, the truth is that the reason the war happened is Iran needed to obstruct and, if possible, prevent Israel from making peace with Saudi Arabia and actually creating an alliance there, both economically and militarily, that could harm Iranian interests in the region. Now, what are Iranian interests in the region? Being a 7th century medieval dictatorship at home and exporting that through terrorism, through Hezbollah and various other agents in Syria and Hamas and the Houthis. So, there's sort of a quasi Islamist Iranian empire that they've been able to establish that Israel just rolled up. But they couldn't have imagined it being rolled up, and they thought that this was their chance to stop the accumulation of powers into an alliance that could actually stop them. It turned out the other way. But nevertheless, that's what they were trying to obstruct. And it is not at all in Israel's interests for this war to have happened if they weren't actually genocidal maniacs who were just using it to kill all the Palestinians, which they did not do.
Well, I mean, first of all, we should say what a wonderful thing that President Trump was able somehow to get the remaining living hostages back. That's a huge, huge thing. I want to go back to the spiritual roots of anti-Semitism, because what astonishes me, having written a 600-page book about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who stood in his time almost alone against the anti-Semitism of the Nazis in the German church and so on and so forth. I really find it amazing how many young people today have gullibly gotten sucked into this. Basically, it's kind of amazing to me. They don't seem to understand just the naked evil, the idea of the Holocaust. When you know people who have lived through that, I've met people who have lived through the Holocaust. It's amazing that enough time has passed that there are young people genuinely ignorant of this, and they don't seem to have any guardrails. When somebody like a Nick Puente says, I think Hitler's cool, they're too ignorant to understand how offensive that is. I mean, if somebody said the person who raped your mother and sister was cool, how would that make you feel? For them, it's all an abstraction. Whatever happened, it's numbers, it's history, sort of. They don't really know what to believe. That's kind of the problem, I guess. And so we're seeing it rise now, where there are young people that they think it would be cool to say something transgressive, anything transgressive. What's the most transgressive thing you could say? Hitler is cool, Stalin is cool. But it does break my heart, Rod, that there are young people that have been sucked into this. It breaks my heart that people that are not so young have been sucked in to the Candace Owens world, where she says one thing that's true or asks three good questions, and they follow her off the cliff into lunacy and brokenness. That's kind of where we are right now, and it's a tough spot.
No, it is, and a lot of it, sadly, is within the church. We have a lot of pastors and young people who have rejected dispensationalism, and I'm not commenting on dispensationalism here, but of course our dispensational friends are adamant that the modern state of Israel is a fulfillment of prophecy. And a lot of younger people have rejected that position. And okay, that's fine. I don't support Israel because of prophecy. I support it because it's the only free country in a sea of totalitarians. I support it because it opposes terrorism. I support it because it's our friend and our ally and filled with people who came from here. Those are plenty of reasons. I have plenty of geopolitical reasons. And now that Netanyahu has brought about this capitalist revolution, which has completely transformed Israel in the last 20 years, I have philosophical and economic reasons to support Israel. I don't need to go where some of our friends do, publicly saying God requires you to support Israel. Well, okay, that's probably true, but that's not really the immediate point. But our friends here who are going way too far off the cliff here are saying, well, I don't agree with dispensational eschatology, therefore Israel is evil. Well, that's absurd. I don't like tacos, therefore Mexico is evil. I mean, it's just nonsense. I don't like foreign aid, so Israel is evil. Well, Israel lobbies us, and foreign governments lobbying make them evil. Yeah, but you're not saying that about Qatar. You're not saying that about China. You're not saying that about actually the entire top 10 foreign governments that lobby our government, none of whom are Israel. So, just from beginning to end, there are all these logical fallacies, and I would contend that they are the logical outcome of identity politics. And too many Christians have sent too many of their children to the public schools. They have been indoctrinated for far too long. And the parents thought, well, we'll fix that at home over the dinner table. No, you won't, because they're working comprehensively on the minds of your children, and you're not going to get to and correct everything that happens. So here we are. And this is a real problem we're going to have to deal with in our own camp.
Well, there's a lot there. I think, what you're referring to as dispensational theology, it seems commonsensical to me, ladies and gentlemen, commonsensical that Israel does not exist for 2,000 years. And then out of the ashes of the Holocaust, almost literally, this nation comes into being of people that have been scattered for 2 millennia. I think common sense would say that looks like God's doing. Now, the details are the details. What does that mean? I don't think there's any salvation apart from Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah of the Jews, the Messiah to the world. I don't think there's any salvation apart from him. But the idea that you would say, man, Israel's just like, it's nothing. It doesn't mean anything. I don't know how you could get that. I don't know how you could think that the people who have returned to the land after 2,000 years, that would be nothing. You at least, if you're going to be honest, would say, that's amazing. Really? Wow. Because there's so many groups from that time, the Edomites, the Jebusites, all of these groups have evaporated. But the Jews somehow maintain their identity. Why would that be, ladies and gentlemen? Why would that be? Because they're the people of the book. They're God's people. God chose them for his purposes. And again, that's complicated. We don't have time to get into that now. But to not be amazed by the restoration of a nation of Israel and the land that God gave them so long ago, I just find it to be willful ignorance and looks like anti-Semitism to me. It looks like they're people that have a particular animus for the Jews, for Israel. I don't know how else to see that. Some of them are friends of mine. It's upsetting to me. But I just think that it's a little bit crazy. I write about some of this in my book, Is Atheism Dead? The idea of Israel coming into existence in 1948. Anyway, it's a beautiful thing, folks. No matter what you think of the details, just the idea of that is such a beautiful thing. Anyway, I want to talk about so much else because I have Rod Martin as my guest. Rod, can we talk about China? What is happening with China? What is happening with this president traveling the world, making these trade deals? Tell us about that.
Well, he had a shockingly successful tour of Asia. This was just tremendous. And, obviously China grabs the headlines because China is our primary geopolitical opponent, if not enemy. And so we worked out a trade deal there. It's a 1-year truce, to be sure, but it gets the rare earths flowing. It solves a lot of the short-term problems. You don't really have to look further than this to see who won that battle. Donald Trump is charging about 3 times the tariff to China as China is now charging to us. So, and they agreed to this. So this just validates several of our theories that China is completely dependent on the U.S. market. Not completely in the sense of 100%, but it can't replace us. And without our consumer market, they go into a depression. And I've spent a lot of time talking about that on Fox Business and other places. There's just no way for them to replace the U.S. market. So you have Xi Jinping here, who is very bellicose and has been extremely prone to saber rattling about Taiwan and other things, even nuking Los Angeles. But the truth is he's getting significant pushback in his own regime, particularly from the military, which seems to realize that a lot of that is very counterproductive and probably not anything that China can really pull off in the immediate future. So that's encouraging. That's been interesting to watch. But that's just the headline. The rest of Trump's trip included a massive deal to develop Australian rare earth elements, and not just mining, but processing. Same thing in Southeast Asia. In Japan, huge new investment into the United States, a bunch of defense cooperation that had been kind of developing, but we hadn't fully realized yet. And then, of course, the jewel in the crown is South Korea, where, because American shipbuilding industry has atrophied so thoroughly over the last couple decades, we aren't even able to meet our own requirements for new nuclear submarines. We are supposed to be producing 2 new attack submarines every year. We're actually producing 1.2 per year. And we're obligated, as you know, and this came just before the Asia trip, we're obligated under the AUKUS Pact to start supplying nuclear attack submarines to Australia, which will hugely increase our effectiveness against the Chinese, particularly in the Indian Ocean, and closing the straits if we need to. All of that is really important, but we really don't have the capacity. So Trump goes and works out a deal with the South Koreans that's just remarkable. They're going to put $5 billion out of $350 billion in new investment into the United States. $5 billion is going to go to redevelop the Philadelphia shipyard, where we're going to build them one or more nuclear submarines. So what you end up with is a bunch of Asian powers that are closely intertwined with the United States that effectively function as National Guard units in foreign countries, being paid for by those countries that are augmenting the U.S. military. And the net result is not only the redevelopment of U.S. industrial capacity and job creation, but also the containment of China. So it was a complete romp, a total triumph. And I don't think most of the talking heads understand just the fullness of how big a deal it really is.
I'd like to point out that the late, not very great Dick Cheney told us we should vote for Kamala Harris. Ladies and gentlemen, let us pause to think about that nightmare that I just said. Dick Cheney told us to vote for Kamala Harris. I guess my implication is that Kamala Harris would not have been able to do what Trump just did. I don't think she'd be able to comprehend it if somebody were sitting with a chalkboard, nor would certainly Joe Biden. We have to thank God for this president working on our behalf, doing these things. Frankly, we don't deserve it. It's a gift from God.
Well, and the thing is, not only would Kamala not have attempted any of these things or had the creativity to try them, Dick Cheney didn't. You know, the truth of the matter is, as much as we can legitimately love George W. Bush for many things that he did that were extraordinarily right, he also did a lot of things that were wrong. And Dick Cheney was the most powerful vice president in American history, and for 8 years, never did anything like this. So, you know, we've got NATO over here. The Beltway establishment is telling us Donald Trump is trying to destroy it. The net result of what Donald Trump has done is actually to massively increase its power. So, you know, they're now going to spend 5% of GDP on their defense versus what they were doing, which ranged from like 1.2% to 1.8%. You can thank Donald Trump for that. Ari Fleischer was making that point on a CNBC broadcast a few years ago, that Donald Trump was succeeding in doing what the Bush administration had failed to do for 8 years behind closed doors. And his bellicose rhetoric was clearly working. Well, likewise, these deals in Asia, these are bringing trillions of dollars of new investment into the United States to bring back jobs and construction and manufacturing work that everyone told us could never come back to America, and do so in a way that actually strengthens our defense against China without us actually having to pay for all of it. This is remarkable. And years of Democrat and Republican administrations utterly failed us in all of this.
Well, when you say utterly failed us, first of all, that's true. But I mean, it's a big deal that they failed us. It's a big deal that, people, there was once a time when I thought, hey, George W. Bush is a great president. And now, in comparison to what Trump is doing, I really am ashamed to have thought that he was a great president. I mean, I have to say this every now and again. George W. Bush and Mike Pence refused to endorse Donald Trump in the 2024 election. Folks, that's despicable. Do you understand what a big deal that is? That they were saying, we don't care who wins. We're not going to stick our necks out because we don't care if Kamala Harris is elected. Do you understand how much contempt they have for you if they were unwilling to support Donald Trump, put their bitter feelings aside, whatever their bitter I don't know why they have bitter feelings. I can I can imagine why they think they do. But it's we're living in a time which is so clarifying, Rod, to see what we have been dealing with, the swamp, the uniparty, people who simply didn't care about the average American. They were just like shuffling papers and hoping that they weren't embarrassed somehow, but they weren't really working overtime to help this nation or the world. And Donald Trump is doing things that I cannot help see as anything but astonishing. It's practically unbelievable what he has been doing. And I think we have to also talk about the fact that his willingness to do it, his zeal to work this hard to make right what has been neglected for decades, it's a glorious moment. I don't know how else to see it.
When he could be rich and retired. There's really no reason for him to do this other than just believing in it. And what he's doing is not, literally Hitler. Literally Hitler would be nationalizing every industry, taking total control over the economy and, trundling people off into camps. That's not what's happening here. We are getting control of our border. We are actually raising domestic wages. We are actually bringing housing prices down to something reasonable, since they had soared to the stratosphere under the pressure of 10 million new illegal aliens who had to have housing in just a 4-year span. He is strengthening our allies. He is making them partners, not dependents. And he's getting government out of the business of censoring and canceling us online. So, that's the exact opposite of the other worldview. And a lot of what we're talking about in the Uniparty, which Angelo Codevilla did such a brilliant job of explaining in his book, The Ruling Class, here about 15 years ago. Everybody should go get that on Amazon, The Ruling Class, Angelo Codevilla. But the thing about that is that it is absolutely driven by inertia. The idea of rethinking how we had constructed our international relations during the Cold War, after the Cold War ended, just honestly never occurred to a lot of them. And so we had all these lopsided trade deals and other relationships designed to stand up our allies after they were flattened in World War II and help them stay on side and not succumb to communism. Okay, that makes sense in 1950. It makes sense in 1980. It doesn't make a lot of sense in 2020. And you've got to have some kind of fairness. And the most obvious place where this is a problem is Europe's dependence on Russia for energy, which Trump warned them against. Trump blocked the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Trump did all the right things. Democrats come in and completely undo all of that. So the Ukraine war breaks out, and Europe is completely dependent on Russia. They have sent twice as much money to Moscow in energy purchases as they have to Kiev in military aid. It's absurd. And they're constantly the ones talking about how we should widen the war. They don't have the ability to widen the war. They want us to do it, and they want to play both sides. Now, that's finally changing, and it's only changing because of Donald Trump. But to get there, you actually have to make America strong again. Somebody's got to replace all that Russian energy. I've got a candidate for you, Texas and Louisiana. And that's exactly the deals Trump has negotiated. $700 billion in new energy purchases to Europe from us. And we're going to do the same thing with Japan and Korea and all of our friends. And we're going to take them out of the orbit of dependency they have been in on the Middle East and Russia.
Where do you see things a year from now, 2 years from now? I mean, the national debt ought to concern everyone. We don't hear much about it. I believe that's what Trump is trying to do with the tariffs, trying to move things in the right direction. Where do you see this going?
He's attacking it from multiple directions. The tariffs in the short term generate quite a lot of income. It looks likely that we could see as much as $500 billion in new income from the tariffs in 2026. So that's kind of a big deal. You've got to plug a $1.8 trillion hole. cutting $1 trillion out of free health care going to illegal aliens goes a long way to plugging the hole. Refusing to renew the Obamacare subsidies. And think about the absurdity of that. Obamacare is technically the Affordable Care Act, but you have to subsidize the ACA to be able to make it affordable. And the Democrats were in power and they didn't. They didn't do anything to make it permanent. They made it temporary. And now they just held up the government for 40 days, hostage taking to force Donald Trump to give them all this money. Okay, those things all help with the deficit, but you're never going to really get to the point where you eliminate the deficit or start paying down the national debt until you do what we did in the 90s, which is stimulate enough economic growth and reduce the tax burden and regulatory burden sufficiently that private enterprise booms and therefore tax receipts go up and you start paying down the debt. Until you do that, we're going to continue to have inflation at the door under the best of circumstances, and we're going to continue to have a situation where we're paying more for interest on the national debt than we are for the entire U.S. military. That's got to be reversed before it gets out of hand, because what happens when it gets out of hand is the Federal Reserve will monetize the debt, which will be highly inflationary, and we will slowly but surely impoverish America in exactly the same way that Argentina did in the first half of the 20th century. They were actually richer per capita in 1900 than the United States was. And by 1950, they were what we would today call a third world country. And it was all because of this exact debt spiral. There's only so far you can go with that, on the basis of being the world's reserve currency. Even if you can maintain that out to the horizon, that only gets you so far. So Trump is attacking this from multiple directions. It seems to be working. Certainly Doge is a key part of that. And I think by 2028, we're in a just tremendous economic boom. You'll see a lot of the fruits of that next year, but by 28, it's going to feel like Reagan 84.
Wow. That sounds positive. The only problem is in 84, Reagan was able to be reelected to a second term in 28. It doesn't look, a surfacey reading of the Constitution says that this is Trump's last shot. Steve Bannon has very, very coyly stated that there are ways around that, but he's never clear on what that means, because it does seem to me that, if we were able to elect FDR 4 times, clearly it's something we can do, except for the constitutional amendment that was put in place against it after FDR. So I'm not sure what Bannon is getting at. Can you speculate on what he's getting at? Because I don't think he's just saying that to say it. I find it comical in the way that it triggers the Trump hating left. But I guess I wonder if there is some kind of path to electing Trump again.
Nah, there's no path. But what there is the opportunity to troll. And that trolling is valuable, because if you have the administration working on things that would otherwise suck the oxygen out of the room, and the media would be going crazy over something substantive they really need to get done, and you throw them this red meat that just freaks them all out and they can't help but chase it, then the administration gets breathing space. And that's actually a pretty good lesson from the Reagan years. If you think about it, every time Reagan did anything useful, the media dogpiled him, and all you heard was how evil that was for the next however long, until they came up with the next evil thing he was doing. Well, Trump puts out absurdities like a third term, and they just all go haywire. And normal people are like, well, that's stupid. That's never going to happen. And it isn't ever going to happen. But we have good candidates. I feel really good about who Trump passes the baton to. So, of course, my favorite candidate for president in 2028 is Eric Metaxas. And if he runs, I'm for him. But if not, Then J.D. Vance, I think, is a really good future for us. I think Ron DeSantis is tremendous. He's been a fantastic governor. He did burn some bridges by running against Trump in 23, 24, but the world won't end. Ted Cruz is an amazing guy, and he's brilliant. And, that's just the beginning of our bench. Marco Rubio is turning out to be tremendous. And, honestly, he was a pretty good senator, but I didn't imagine he would be a stellar Secretary of State. So we have a lot of great people to pick from. And what they have to pick from is AOC and Gavin Newsom. I think our chances are pretty good.
I'm beginning to think Stephen Miller should run for president. He is the only one that kind of channels Trump's lunatic energy against the enemies of this country, and I delight in that. I love Stephen Miller. I think it is interesting to me, Rod, because when we talk about this, Trump's energy and his willingness to do the thing everyone says you shouldn't do or you can't do, that's what we have been lacking. And that's why he is such a breath of fresh air. That's why he harkens back to the founding generation. These were people who would talk about Cincinnatus and his plow, the farmer, the businessman who goes to serve for a season and then goes back to his plow. That's who we're supposed to be. That's what Donald Trump has been. He was not a politician until 2016, folks. Think about it. Actually, until January 2017, he was a businessman. And so that part of me, that's what I find so refreshing, is that we're seeing a sea change in everything, in how we do politics. And I hope it continues. Rod, there's never enough time to talk to you. Thank you for being my guest. We'll have you back as soon as possible. Really appreciate you.
Wonderful. Good to be here.